The morning of June 4th, 1942, dawned with deceptive calm across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of his flagship, the mighty battleship Yamato, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he gazed toward the horizon where destiny awaited. The architect of Pearl Harbor had conceived another audacious plan, one that would either crush American naval power forever or seal Japan's fate in the Pacific War. 6 months had passed since the surprise attack that brought America into the global conflict, and Yamamoto knew the sleeping giant was awakening. His intelligence officers had reported increased American naval activity, new ships rolling off production lines at an alarming rate, and a determination in Washington that spelled trouble for the empire of the rising sun. The window for Japanese dominance was closing rapidly, and Yamamoto believed only one decisive blow could keep it open. The Japanese fleet approaching Midway Atoll represented the cream of the Imperial Navy. 4 aircraft carriers led by the veteran Akagi, Yamamoto's former flagship, accompanied by Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. These floating fortresses carried over 200 of Japan's finest aircraft and most experienced pilots. Men who had honed their skills in the skies over China and proven their mettle at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the carrier-striking force with the confidence born of 6 months of uninterrupted victory. His pilots were the elite of the Imperial Navy Air Service, their Zero fighters and Valdive bombers having swept American and Allied forces from the Pacific with seemingly effortless superiority. As Nagumo reviewed his battle plans one final time, he felt certain that the small American garrison on Midway would fall within hours, drawing the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a trap that would finish what Pearl Harbor had started. This historical context regarding Yamamoto's strategic thinking has been referenced from Walter Lord's comprehensive account, Incredible Victory, which provides detailed insights into Japanese naval planning during this period. Unknown to the Japanese commanders, their greatest advantage, surprise, had already been lost. Deep in the basement of a nondescript building in Pearl Harbor, a team of American cryptographers led by Commander Joseph Rochefort had achieved what many considered impossible. They had broken the Japanese naval code JN-25, allowing them to read Admiral Yamamoto's most secret communications like an open book. The intelligence breakthrough revealed not just the Japanese target, Midway, but also the timing, the forces involved, and even the tactical approach Nagumo would employ. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters in Hawaii, found himself in possession of information that could turn the tables on Japan's seemingly invincible navy. The question remained whether America's battered fleet could capitalize on this precious advantage. As the Japanese task force steamed eastward through the pre-dawn darkness of June 4th, confident in their strength and secrecy, they sailed unknowingly toward a rendezvous with history that would reshape the entire course of the Pacific War. 300 miles northeast of Midway, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance paced the flag bridge of the USS Enterprise, his mind racing through the countless variables that would determine victory or defeat in the coming battle. Unlike his Japanese counterparts, Spruance carried the heavy burden of knowing his enemy's plans while commanding a force significantly outnumbered by the approaching Imperial fleet. The American task forces, centered around the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, represented nearly everything the U.S. Navy had left in the Pacific. The Yorktown, severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just a month earlier, had limped into Pearl Harbor with a gaping hole in her flight deck. Navy shipyard workers had performed what many called a miracle, completing repairs estimated to take 3 months in just 72 hours. Now she sailed toward battle with civilian technicians still aboard, welding and hammering even as her aircraft prepared for combat. Captain Mark Mitcher stood alongside his pilots on the Enterprise's flight deck, watching the final preparations for what everyone knew would be a desperate gamble. The American air crews were largely inexperienced compared to their Japanese opponents. Many had never seen combat, and few possessed the years of training that characterized the enemy's elite aviators. What they lacked in experience, however, they would have to make up for in courage and determination. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, leader of Torpedo Squadron 6, gathered his 14 TBD Devastator crews around him for final instructions. These obsolete aircraft, already proven vulnerable in previous encounters, would have to penetrate the protective screen of Zero fighters and accurate anti-aircraft fire to deliver their torpedoes at point-blank range. Lindsay knew the odds. Previous torpedo attacks had resulted in catastrophic losses with little to show for the sacrifice. Meanwhile, on Midway itself, the small garrison of Marines, sailors, and airmen prepared for an assault they knew was coming. Colonel Harold Shannon's Marine fighters, a mixed collection of obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and a handful of newer Wildcats, would have to challenge the finest carrier aircraft in the world. The island's anti-aircraft gunners cleaned their weapons one final time and checked their ammunition supplies, knowing that soon they would face the fury of Japanese naval aviation. As dawn broke across the Pacific on June 4th, reconnaissance aircraft from both fleets took to the skies. Japanese search planes spread out in a fan-shaped pattern, looking for the American fleet that intelligence suggested might be in the area. American PBY Catalina flying boats from Midway began their own search, hoping to locate the Japanese carriers before Nagumo's strike force could launch their attack on the island. At 0430 hours, Ensign Jack Reed, piloting a PBY from Midway, spotted the first elements of the Japanese fleet. His electrifying radio message, "Enemy carriers bearing 320, distance 180 miles, set in motion a series of events that would determine the fate of nations. The Battle of Midway had begun, and neither side yet realized they were about to witness one of the most decisive naval engagements in human history. At 0430 hours, the pre-dawn tranquility shattered as Admiral Nagumo's carriers began launching the first wave of their devastating assault on Midway Atoll. 108 aircraft, 36 Kate torpedo bombers loaded with armor-piercing bombs, 36 Val dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters roared off the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu in a precisely choreographed ballet of destruction. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, leading the strike force, adjusted his radio headset as his Kate bomber climbed steadily toward Midway. Below him, the Pacific stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface painted gold and crimson by the rising sun. Tominaga had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack and subsequent campaigns across the Pacific, and he possessed the supreme confidence that came from 6 months of uninterrupted victory. Today's mission seemed almost routine. Suppress the American defenses on Midway, then return to rearm for the decisive blow against the U.S. fleet when it inevitably appeared. On Midway, radar operators detected the incoming Japanese formation while it was still over 100 miles away. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll as Marines and sailors scrambled to battle stations. Colonel Kimes, commanding the island's defense, ordered every available aircraft into the air, knowing that anything caught on the ground would be destroyed in the coming assault. 26 Marine fighters, 20 obsolete Brewster F-2A Buffaloes, and 6 Grumman F-4F Wildcats climbed desperately to intercept the approaching armada. Major Floyd Parks, leading the Marine fighters, knew his pilots faced overwhelming odds. The Buffalo, already obsolete when the war began, stood little chance against the superbly maneuverable Zero in aerial combat. Yet these Marines understood their mission: delay and disrupt the Japanese attack, regardless of the cost. The air battle erupted 50 miles northwest of Midway as the Marine fighters plunged into Tominaga's formation. Captain Marion Carl, flying one of the precious Wildcats, opened fire on a Zero at close range, watching his bullets tear through the enemy fighter's engine cowling. The Japanese aircraft burst into flames and spiraled toward the ocean, but Carl had no time to savor his victory as 2 more Zeros closed on his tail. The detailed account of Marine fighter performance during the Midway attack has been documented extensively in the official U.S. Marine Corps historical records, which provide comprehensive analysis of tactical decisions made during this crucial engagement. The outmatched Marine fighters fought with desperate courage, but the outcome was predetermined by the vast disparity in aircraft performance and pilot experience. Within minutes, 15 of the 26 American fighters had been shot down, their pilots either killed or floating in life rafts in the shark-infested Pacific. The surviving Marines, their ammunition exhausted and aircraft damaged, disengaged and limped back toward Midway. With the American fighter screen eliminated, Tomonaga's bombers pressed their attack on the island installations. Bombs rained down on the airfield, fuel storage tanks, and defensive positions as Midway disappeared beneath clouds of smoke and dust. The powerhouse, seaplane hangar, and several aircraft caught on the ground were destroyed, while anti-aircraft guns blazed away at the diving Japanese bombers. Despite the intensity of the attack, Midway's defenses remained largely intact. As Tomonaga surveyed the damage from his bomber, he realized that a second strike would be necessary to neutralize the American base completely. His radio message to Admiral Nagumo, "There is need for a second attack," would prove to be one of the most fateful communications in naval history, setting in motion a chain of events that would seal the fate of the Japanese carrier force. Admiral Nagumo received Tomonaga's message at 0700 hours, just as his worst fears began materializing on the horizon. American aircraft from Midway, every plane that could still fly, were already approaching his task force in a series of uncoordinated but determined attacks. The Japanese admiral faced a dilemma that would haunt military strategists for generations. Should he rearm his second wave for another strike on Midway, or should he prepare for the naval battle he increasingly suspected was coming? The first American attacks came from Midway's surviving bombers, Army B-26 Marauders and Navy TBF Avengers flying their first combat mission. These attacks, though pressed with suicidal courage, achieved little beyond demonstrating American determination. The Japanese fighter screen and anti-aircraft fire tore apart the inexperienced American formations, sending plane after plane spiraling into the Pacific in trails of smoke and flame. Captain Richard Fleming's Marine SBD Dauntless dive bombers followed, diving through intense anti-aircraft fire to attack the Japanese carriers. Fleming himself, his aircraft riddled with enemy fire and trailing smoke, deliberately dove his damaged bomber into the carrier Mikuma's forward superstructure, the first kamikaze attack of the Pacific War, though it would not be recognized as such until years later. Nagumo, watching these desperate American attacks from Akagi's bridge, made the fateful decision to rearm his second wave with bombs for another strike on Midway. Aboard all 4 Japanese carriers, ordnance crews began the laborious process of removing armor-piercing bombs from aircraft and replacing them with high-explosive bombs suitable for attacking land targets. Torpedoes were wheeled back to storage magazines, and the flight decks became cluttered with weapons, fuel lines, and ammunition. At 0728 hours, everything changed. A Japanese scout plane, launched hours earlier on a routine search mission, finally transmitted the message that sent shockwaves through the Imperial fleet. 10 enemy surface ships bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The American fleet, the primary target of Yamamoto's entire operation, had been found. The discovery created chaos in Japanese tactical thinking. Nagumo now faced attacking aircraft from Midway, the imminent return of his own first strike force, low on fuel and needing immediate landing, and the likelihood of American carrier aircraft approaching from the newly discovered fleet. His carrier's decks were cluttered with bombs and fuel, his combat air patrol was being steadily whittled down by the constant American attacks, and his crews were exhausted from hours of general quarters. At 0800 hours, the scout plane transmitted an amplifying report that struck terror into Japanese hearts. Enemy force, accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The Americans had not only found the Japanese fleet, but possessed the means to strike back with their own carrier aircraft. Nagumo hesitated, a pause that would cost him the battle and ultimately the war in the Pacific. Should he launch an immediate attack with his rearmed bombers, or should he wait for his first strike to return, then rearm everything for a properly coordinated assault on the American fleet? The decision demanded split-second timing, perfect coordination, and a little luck. In war, commanders rarely enjoy the luxury of perfect information or unlimited time, and Nagumo would soon discover that hesitation in battle often proves fatal. At 0800 hours, as Admiral Nagumo wrestled with his impossible decision, American dive bombers were already winging their way toward the Japanese fleet from 3 different carriers. The stage was set for the most decisive 30 minutes in the history of naval warfare, a brief span that would determine whether Japan or America would dominate the Pacific for the remainder of World War II. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, had been airborne for over 2 hours, searching for the Japanese fleet that intelligence promised would be found. His fuel gauge showed dangerously low levels, and several of his pilots had already been forced to turn back toward their carrier. McCluskey faced the agonizing decision that confronted military leaders throughout history: continue the search and risk losing his entire squadron to fuel starvation, or abandon the mission and preserve his aircraft for future operations. McCluskey chose to press on, following a lone Japanese destroyer that appeared to be heading northeast at high speed. His instincts proved correct when, at 0955 hours, the entire Japanese carrier force appeared spread out below him like toys on a blue carpet. 4 aircraft carriers steamed in formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance, perfect targets for dive bombing attack. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie was approaching from the southwest with 17 Dauntless bombers from the Yorktown. Leslie had experienced his own navigation challenges, but like McCluskey, his persistence was about to be rewarded with the opportunity of a lifetime. The 2 American formations had found the Japanese fleet at precisely the moment when it was most vulnerable. Admiral Nagumo's carriers presented a scene of barely controlled chaos. On Akagi's flight deck, ordnance crews were frantically rearming aircraft for the 3rd time that morning, first with bombs for Midway, then with torpedoes for the American fleet. Now back to bombs as conflicting priorities created confusion and delay. Fuel lines snaked across the deck, ammunition was stacked in open storage, and exhausted sailors worked with desperate efficiency to prepare their aircraft for whatever mission their admiral would finally decide upon. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, depleted by hours of fighting off American attacks from Midway, was caught at low altitude as McCluskey's and Leslie's dive bombers approached from 20,000 feet. Most of the Zero fighters were either landing to refuel and rearm or engaging the remnants of the American torpedo attacks that had been arriving in piecemeal fashion throughout the morning. The tactical situation during this critical phase has been extensively analyzed in Samuel Eliot Morrison's official naval history, The Two-Ocean War, which provides detailed chronological documentation of the coordination failures that left Japanese carriers exposed to dive bomber attack. At 10:22 hours, McCluskey rolled his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive toward the carrier Kaga, beginning the attack that would change the course of history. His 1,000-pound bomb, released at 1,500 feet, struck Kaga amidships, penetrating her flight deck and detonating among the rearmed aircraft below. Secondary explosions from fuel and ammunition created a chain reaction of destruction that transformed the massive carrier into a blazing inferno within minutes. Simultaneously, Leslie's bombers dove on the Soryu, achieving equally devastating results. The carrier, caught with her flight deck packed with fueled and armed aircraft, erupted in flames as American bombs found their mark. The explosions were so massive that they could be heard 20 miles away, and the smoke columns rose 10,000 feet into the tropical sky. The hunters had become the hunted, and Japan's path to Pacific dominance was disappearing in smoke and flame beneath the relentless American dive bomber attack. The destruction of Kaga and Soryu within minutes of each other sent shockwaves through the Japanese fleet that reverberated far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo watched in horror as two-thirds of his carrier-striking force transformed into blazing pyres, their aircraft and crews consumed by the very weapons they had intended to use against American targets. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading the 2nd Division of Enterprise bombers, had selected Akagi as his target, recognizing the distinctive red and white striped flight deck of Admiral Nagumo's flagship. His 1,000-pound bomb struck just aft of the carrier's midships elevator, penetrating deep into the ship's vitals before exploding among the rearmed aircraft in the hangar deck. The blast ignited aviation gasoline and exploded bombs and torpedoes, creating a hell of flame and smoke that quickly spread throughout the ship. Captain Taijiro Aoki, commanding Akagi, found his flagship transformed from the pride of the Imperial Navy into a death trap within moments. Fires raged uncontrollably through the ship, fed by aviation fuel and ammunition that exploded in secondary blasts of devastating power. The carrier's damage control systems, designed to handle normal combat damage, proved inadequate against the comprehensive destruction wrought by the American attack. On Akagi's bridge, Admiral Nagumo stood transfixed by the catastrophe unfolding around him. Smoke poured through the ship's ventilation systems, making breathing difficult and forcing the command staff to cover their faces with wet cloths. The admiral who had commanded the attack on Pearl Harbor now faced the complete destruction of his striking force, achieved by the same type of dive-bombing tactics that had proven so devastating 6 months earlier in Hawaii. Commander Minoru Genda, Nagumo's air operations officer and one of the primary architects of the Pearl Harbor attack, urged his admiral to transfer his flag to a nearby cruiser and continue directing the battle. The decision to abandon Akagi represented more than tactical necessity. It symbolized the end of Japanese naval dominance in the Pacific and the beginning of America's long march toward Tokyo Bay. The sole surviving Japanese carrier, Hiryu, commanded by Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, immediately launched a counterattack against the American fleet. Yamaguchi, recognizing that his force faced annihilation, ordered every available aircraft into the air for a desperate assault on the enemy carriers. 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters led by Lieutenant Mikio Kobayashi set course for the American task force, determined to exact revenge for their fallen comrades. The Japanese counterstrike found the USS Yorktown, already damaged from the Battle of the Coral Sea, and hastily repaired at Pearl Harbor. Kobayashi's bombers, displaying the skill and determination that had characterized Japanese naval aviation throughout the war, penetrated the American fighter screen and scored 3 direct hits on Yorktown's flight deck. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, commanding Yorktown, watched his ship's damage control parties battle the flames and flooding with the same professional competence that had kept her fighting after the Coral Sea engagement. The carrier's survival testified to American shipbuilding quality and crew training, but also highlighted the price being paid for victory in the Pacific. As the afternoon of June 4th wore on, both fleets had suffered grievous losses, but the strategic situation remained clear. Japan had lost 3/4 of its carrier striking force, while America retained 2 operational carriers and the ability to continue offensive operations. The balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted decisively, though the final act of the Midway drama remained to be played. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier, surveying the smoke columns that marked the funeral pyres of his comrades' ships. Around him, the remnants of the once mighty mobile force struggled to maintain formation while fighting fires, rescuing survivors, and preparing for what everyone understood would be a final desperate counterstroke against the American fleet. Yamaguchi, considered one of the most aggressive and capable flag officers in the Imperial Navy, refused to accept defeat despite the overwhelming evidence of disaster surrounding his task force. If Hiryu was destined to join her sister ships on the bottom of the Pacific, she would at least strike one final blow against the enemy that had achieved such devastating tactical surprise. At 1:30 hours, Yamaguchi launched his second attack of the day. 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters under the command of Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same officer who had led the morning strike on Midway. Tomonaga's aircraft had been damaged during the earlier attack, his fuel tank punctured by American anti-aircraft fire, but he volunteered to lead this final mission, knowing he lacked sufficient fuel to return to his carrier. The Japanese strike force found the American fleet just as Admiral Spruance was recovering his aircraft from the morning's devastating attack on the enemy carriers. The USS Yorktown, still struggling to repair damage from the previous Japanese assault, became the focus of Tomonaga's final attack. Despite intense anti-aircraft fire and determined fighter opposition, the Japanese torpedo bombers pressed their attack with suicidal determination. Tomonaga himself, his aircraft trailing smoke and losing altitude steadily, aimed his damaged Kate directly at Yorktown's port side. His torpedo, released at point-blank range, struck the carrier below the waterline, opening massive holes in her hull and causing severe flooding that brought her to a dead stop in the water. The young lieutenant's sacrifice achieved what his superiors had demanded: revenge against the American fleet that had destroyed Japan's carrier aviation in a single morning. Captain Buckmaster, recognizing that his ship faced imminent sinking, ordered Yorktown abandoned. The crew's evacuation proceeded with the disciplined efficiency that characterized American naval operations throughout the war. But the sight of the listing carrier represented a significant tactical victory for the dying Japanese force. The heroic final actions of Lieutenant Tomonaga and the Japanese air crews during these desperate attacks have been documented in detail by Japanese naval historians, particularly in Mitsuo Fuchida's post-war memoir, Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, which provides first-hand accounts of these final missions. Admiral Yamaguchi, observing the success of Tomonaga's attack, immediately prepared Hiryu's remaining aircraft for one final strike. Every plane that could fly, 5 Valdive bombers and 4 Zero fighters, received orders to attack the American carriers regardless of the odds against survival. These air crews, many of them veterans of Pearl Harbor and the early Pacific campaigns, understood they were flying to their deaths, but Japanese naval tradition demanded no less than complete sacrifice in the face of defeat. As afternoon turned toward evening on June 4, 1942, both fleets had paid a terrible price for their ambitions in the Central Pacific. The Japanese mobile force, which had dominated Pacific waters for 6 months, lay burning and sinking, while American carriers continued launching strikes against the crippled enemy vessels. The battle that would determine the course of the Pacific War was approaching its climax, but neither side had yet delivered the final blow that would decide victory or defeat. As twilight approached on June 4, 1942, Admiral Yamaguchi made his final decision aboard the doomed carrier Hiryu. Rather than abandon his ship and survive the defeat that had befallen the Imperial Navy, he chose to observe the ancient Japanese tradition of sharing the fate of his command. His message to Admiral Yamamoto was brief, but profound. "Hiryu is burning, and I shall remain aboard to share her destiny." At 5:00 hours, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown found Hiryu steaming alone, her escort vessels scattered and her flight deck empty of aircraft. The American attack was swift and decisive. 4 direct hits transformed Japan's last operational carrier into a blazing wreck, her hangar deck erupting in the same devastating explosions that had claimed her sister ships earlier that day. Yamaguchi's choice to remain with his ship reflected the broader Japanese naval philosophy that defeat in battle brought dishonor worse than death. As Hiryu settled deeper into the Pacific swells, her admiral stood calmly on the bridge, declining rescue attempts by nearby destroyers. His sacrifice symbolized the end of an era in naval warfare and the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. The final tally of the Battle of Midway staggered military observers on both sides of the Pacific. Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with more than 300 aircraft and many of the Imperial Navy's most experienced pilots. The cream of Japanese naval aviation, trained over years of intensive preparation, had been destroyed in a single day of combat. American losses, while significant, paled in comparison to the Japanese catastrophe. The USS Yorktown, abandoned but still afloat, would eventually be sunk by a Japanese submarine, and the destroyer Hamon was lost to the same attack. 150 American aircraft were destroyed, and 307 American servicemen gave their lives for victory. The strategic implications of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's carrier striking force, which had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The Imperial Navy would never again possess the strength to launch major offensive operations against American positions, while the United States Navy gained the initiative that would carry it across thousands of miles of ocean to Tokyo Bay. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving reports of the disaster from his flagship hundreds of miles away, immediately ordered the remainder of the Japanese fleet to withdraw from the Midway area. The architect of Pearl Harbor understood that his gamble had failed catastrophically, leaving Japan in a defensive posture from which it would never recover. Emperor Hirohito, informed of the defeat in his palace in Tokyo, received the news in characteristic silence. The emperor, who had approved the Midway operation in hopes of ending the war through decisive victory, now faced the prospect of a prolonged conflict against an increasingly powerful American adversary. The brief period of Japanese expansion across the Pacific had ended, and the Empire of the Rising Sun began its long journey toward inevitable defeat. The Battle of Midway demonstrated that superior intelligence, tactical innovation, and individual courage could overcome numerical disadvantage and initial strategic surprise. The American victory marked the turning point of the Pacific War and established the foundation for the island-hopping campaign that would eventually bring Allied forces to the Japanese home islands. As the survivors of both fleets limped away from the battlefield, the Pacific Ocean began reclaiming the wreckage of the greatest carrier battle in naval history. But the consequences of those 4 decisive days in June would resonate throughout the remainder of World War II and beyond.